By the turn of the century, the railways had spread so far throughout the country that few people lived more than 10 miles from a station. All the main lines have been completed. The Great Northern to Belfast, the Great Southern and Western to Cork, the Midland Great Western to Galway, and the Dublin South Eastern to Wexford, which had grown out of the original Dublin to Kingstown Railway. From these main lines, branch lines spread out into the most remote rural areas, forming a cobweb of services operated by a multitude of companies. The dream of the early pioneers had been realized, and the land was truly ironed. But in the 60 years that it had taken this to happen, circumstances in Ireland had changed dramatically.
The world of the railways knew, and the way the world of the railways made, vanished in the 20th century. It vanished partly because the First World War put enormous strain on labour costs, partly, I think, more fundamentally, more enduringly, obviously because of motor transport, lorries, buses, and so on, create, a very powerful rival where the railways previously had virtual monopoly. So if you've enjoyed a monopoly for 70 or 80 years, and suddenly you're faced with very powerful competition, which you have very little opportunity of countering because the railways are fixed.
Mind you, it had taken some ingenuity to reach the more remote parts of the western seaboard. In Donegal, there had been over a dozen lines, some going only a few miles. While down in County Clare, a branch line was to achieve immortal status.
Well, the narrow gauge is actually a quite rational response to the economic circumstances of the west of Ireland. No railway company would advance into the far west. And we're talking about Dingle Peninsula, we're talking about parts of Clare, we're talking about parts of Connemara, would advance that far on the standard gauge. It would cost too much to build the lines. They couldn't make a profit on the capital costs incurred. So what do you do in those circumstances? Well, you look for a narrower gauge. And they were built at something like a third or a quarter of the cost of the general railway system, and they undoubtedly helped develop the areas.
Many of them were never profitable. And the books say about one company that only existed for about 18 months. But there was great public unhappiness with the railways, a belief that the railways should be able to solve all sorts of problems that they weren't solving.
Ireland was one of the worst countries in the world from a railwayman's point of view, not physically, but economically. What do railways need? They need big urban centres between which there will be massive passenger traffic. We haven't got that in Ireland. There was basically only Dublin, Belfast catching up, but for a number of reasons, the amount of traffic between Dublin and Belfast was relatively limited. Belfast looked outward, Dublin looked outward. They both looked parallel in a way, rather than one to the other. So you don't have the type of passenger, or the type of demographic structure that's necessary for a thriving passenger trade.
In Dublin, the trams, which had been horse-drawn, gave way to motor-driven, with huge increases in customers. But if worldwide the railways were being threatened by the combustion engine, in Ireland the upheaval of the World War was not eased by the end of that war in 1918. The effect of the rebellion of 1916 and then the Civil War running into the 1920s meant that the railways were surviving from crisis to crisis. There was no space to address its underlying and deteriorating economic state.
During the Civil War, the irregulars, as they were officially described, they sought to disturb communications which would be used by the Free State Army to travel from one place to another quickly. And if they could isolate parts of Munster from Dublin and the Free State Army, well, you know, some important advantages would be achieved. So there was great interference with the railway.
In the 2 years of the Civil War, 400 locomotives were damaged or destroyed. Lines and bridges were blown up. About a third of the network was rendered inoperable, mainly in Munster. The railways were threatened with closure until this fearsome machine went into action, a kind of tank on tracks.
One's whole training as a railway man, and certainly the railway manager, the whole ethos of one's background and so on, would have left very few of them, I think, anti-treaty.
By the 1920s, much had changed for the railways. Since 1916, wages had risen 3 times higher than receipts. A new native government led by W.T. Cosgrave was trying to put a new shape on many aspects of life in the Free State.
It didn't take long before the Cosgrave government took the initiative of approaching the railway companies and saying, we want you to agree an amalgamation scheme. And gave a deadline of, let's say, 18 months, whatever the period was. And you come back to us with the scheme, and if you don't come back to us, we will take the initiative and we will decide how you should amalgamate. And they did agree on the scheme for amalgamating all the railways with 4 or 5 exceptions.
Most Irish railway companies became incorporated into the Great Southern and Western. The company now had more than 2,000 miles of track and 600 locomotives. And the effect of absorbing the many smaller companies was a saving of £500,000 in 1927. But even with incorporation and the closure of some of the more unprofitable branch lines, the rising costs of coal and labour in the 1930s again led to losses. On top of that, the railway companies were facing increasing pressure because of competition from road transport.
In the 1930s, with the advance of road transport, for passengers and freight, action was taken by the Cumann na nGaedheal government and then by the Fianna Fáil government as it came in 1932. 3 acts in all, I think, which, with regard to passenger transport, road passenger transport, introduced a licensing system for buses. Didn't mean that private operators couldn't exist, but private operators would have to seek a license to operate a route. They would have to publish a timetable. They would have to have their fares approved.
That's how the railways coped with the competition of buses, by buying them out and running them themselves. Now timetables could be coordinated for road and rail. But that, of course, put more pressure on those small lines all over the country which served small communities at a leisurely pace, but which, on an accountant's set of figures, didn't make sense to keep open.
Well, Irish railway life in general, it would be fair to say, had a fairly relaxed rhythm. And the further west you went, which meant the further narrow gauge you went, the more relaxed it became. And obviously the West Clare Railway is the classic, and Percy French is the classic exemplar of all of that. But that wouldn't be too far out in catching what you might call the dynamism of life in that part of the world. And why should it be different? After all, why chase around all day if you're only going to have a couple of trains puffing back and forth? The downside was they couldn't create the jobs for the people who were born there. The upside was that for many of those who stayed, there was a relaxed rhythm of life, as I've said, and the railway fitted into that life rather than transforming it.
In fact, there's a case for saying that much of the Western Seaboard in the 1930s was as much in the late 19th century as in the 20th. Bled by emigration, subsisting on small holdings. The real world was outside, and yet the railways were a taken-for-granted passage to that outside world. And the people and families who worked on the railways knew a security of tenure that others didn't have.
In my case, my grandfather started life on the Killala Road, the road between Ballina and Killala. And again, the records would show that in 1913 that he moved up to Athlone and the company supplied him with a railway house. By 1939, I got a call And I got temporary work on the railway for a beat season in 1939, and I left the technical school for 10 weeks, where I got a first glimpse of what life was like in a local shed. And I presented myself for interview, and my interview with Mr. McKay was 3 minutes in the shed yard. It was a very, very busy yard with a big number of steam engines coming and going and great activity. There was a number of cleaners cleaning engines, and there was engines being coaled, and there was fires being cleaned out, and a tremendous amount of work going on. So the foreman gave me 3 minutes. He says to me on a Saturday evening, while he looked out at the Battery Hills, he says, if you come in at 8:30 on Monday morning, he says, Tommy Hinshaw will give you a start. So with my father's overalls, I arrived a fresh-faced cleaner at the shed in October of 1939. And I was presented with a scraper, and I was told to scrape the wheels of steam engines. At the end of the week, when you got your 25 shillings, which was the rate in those days, and there was 1 and 3 pence stopped for a stamp, you forgot the misery of the week when you got this wonderful pound in your hand and you gave it to your mother and you held on to the 3 and 6 pence to enjoy yourself for the rest of the week.
The 1930s were a lean time. There was an international recession following the Wall Street crash. Even in isolated Ireland on the edge of Europe, there was a knock-on effect, compounded by the so-called economic war with Britain, which affected the cattle trade.
One of the most important businesses for the railways was the carriage of animals, of live animals. And as that was affected adversely for some years, the railways suffered. And that, in addition to the advance of road freight, whether by contractors or by private individuals moving their own freight or just travelling, contributed to the deterioration of the railways.
The reaction of governments when they're faced with a serious quandary is quite predictable. They set up a commission or a committee. In this case, the commission concluded there's insufficient income to meet liabilities. In other words, the railways were broke. Again, they balked at taking them in hand and paying for them. But as the debate continued, the outbreak of the Second World War changed the nature of the problem.
The war was now on for 6 or 7 months, and the coal stocks were now drying up. Like the railroad company would have thousands of tons stocked up over the years, and they would buy from Yorkshire and from Cardiff. That's where the best quality coal came from. So for the first few months, I found that trains ran with monotonous regularity. You could set your watch, but then suddenly the good quality coal was gone, and they were now relying on native fuel, which was turf and timber and a type of briquette, and they tried everything, but they couldn't maintain the pressure on the steam engines with this poor quality coal. And it led to an awful lot of frustrations, and trains ran out of path. The train that would normally come in from Dublin in 2 hours and a half, it might be 5 or 7 hours before it arrives. And then arriving in Athlone, the fire would have to be cleaned out, and a lot of turf put up on the footplate and into the firebox, and timber. And the driver and fireman, as best they could, they would carry on to Galway further 48 miles. All in all, the overall trip from Dublin could be now 78 hours. People were fortunate to get from Dublin to Galway. And then there came a time where we only had 2 passenger trains a week, on Tuesday and Thursday, because whatever supplies they had, they kept them for the goods trains and the movement of cattle trains, which were essential.
It's not because we don't realise the nature of the odds we have to beat.
Lemass, one of those key figures credited with modernising Ireland, proposed a new company which would be an amalgam of private and public ownership. It would take under its control most of the railways and private bus routes in the state, as well as the Dublin United Transport Company, which ran the trams. It would be modelled somewhat along the lines of the ESB. It would have the commercial freedom to operate in the market, but with a first requirement of public service.
Sean Lemass, then Minister for Industry and Commerce, said there was going to be a shortage of oil and petrol, The railways are going to be the main system of public transport. There are going to be coal shortages. The whole system needs to be taken under government control, and we will pay the bill virtually.
An acrimonious debate in the Dáil resulted in De Valera resigning on the bill to set up a unified transport company which would cover the whole country.
Defeated over the transport bill on a technicality, as the opposition thought, but it gave him the opportunity to seek a new mandate, which he got. In 1944, the bill creating Córas Úmpar Éireann was then passed by a substantial Fianna Fáil majority, and Córas Úmpar Éireann came into existence on the 1st of January 1945.
It's worth noting that around that time, CIE had about 500 steam locomotives in perhaps 80 different types, and the average age, I think, of those engines was about 50 years, which just shows how little had been invested in the railway since the turn of the century.
Far removed from the debates of economists and statisticians, the railways had embedded themselves in the social life of the country. Trains were part of everyday life, more especially in provincial Ireland, where a day trip or a journey to town became an event and an adventure. On the wider national scale, the growth of the GAA was enhanced by the rail network.
We'd normally leave Valentia Harbour, that's called Renard Point, at 10 p.m. We'd get to Houston at 6:30 a.m. Then our mission was somewhere to get mass, wash ourselves, and have a bit of breakfast and head to Croke Park. I was often in Croke Park long before 12 o'clock, before the gates opened.
You could probably argue that until very recently, the railway had been an essential medium for the fostering and the sustaining of the DAA at the level which has made it such a fantastic national organisation.
Not for the first time, the railways were becoming something of a political football between parties. As ever, too, the government was blamed for a severe winter, or at least for the failure of the railways to cope with it.
No sooner was CIE set up than the post-war crisis of fuel supplies became a serious problem. Britain had very little coal for export. The winter of 1947 was one of the worst in recorded meteorological history. Some locomotives were converted to oil burning, but really the railways were in an extremely difficult condition.
The first inter-party or coalition government took office. Daniel Morrissey, Fine Gael minister, businessman, auctioneer, became Minister for Industry and Commerce. He gets a letter from Reynolds of CIE telling him that CIE was going to now lose $250,000 last year, and in the coming year it's going to lose almost $1 million.
So by 1949, within months of the Free State becoming formally a republic, the new Republican government finally did what other governments had strenuously avoided. They nationalised the railways. Which is to say, the new republic bought them lock, stock and barrel.
And then there could be no avoiding the fact that public transport, and particularly the condition of the railways and the losses they were making, were very much in the political domain. And politicians had to be answerable for the problems on public transport in the country.
For all its claims to sovereignty, the new republic of the 1950s could not provide jobs or housing for much of its people. Emigration resumed on a scale and momentum not seen since the Great Famine of 100 years before.
It was like a clatter of clay and stones on the coffin. There really was a terrible finality about it. And of course I know now that it was the old life ending. And then there was the guard's whistle to stand clear. And you'd hear the engine getting up ahead of steam and the carriage couplings jerking a line.
And after that,
We waved a handkerchief and we watched the handkerchief disappearing over the top of the hill there.
Like much of the West, the Roscommon area was badly hit. Albert Reynolds was a railway clerk, later to become a TD, then to hold government portfolios for transport, and later again, Taoiseach.
I left school at a very difficult time to get any job in the early 50s, and actually the first permanent job I got was with CIE and the railways, a goods and ticket office clerical officer at a place called Drummond, County Leitrim. I remember one afternoon where a friend of mine was taking the train to Birmingham, or taking the boat to Birmingham, as more commonly known at the time. And he had arrived at the ticket office with £3 for a ticket to Birmingham, which at the time was £2, 10 shillings, be £2.50 in today's, I think, £2, 10 shillings, and he handed in £3, and that's all he had. And when I gave him out the ticket and the change, I says, Mel, do you have any more? And he said, no, that's my lot. And he had a brown parcel under his arm with a few bits of clothes or something. So I took back in the ticket and I got a different one from at the very end of the stock. And I gave him out to one. I gave him back his £2, 10 shillings, and said, look, the best of luck, and I hope you make it. 24 years later, as minister, I walks into a function in Birmingham, and the first guy up to me is a guy called Mel Farrell from Ruski, who by then had a family of 6, had done very well, and says, I owe you £3. I said, no, you owe it to CIE.
By 1955, we had the diesel era, when 60 engines were bought from Metropolitan Vickers. The steam then was phased out, and we had mixed feelings watching those big engines and small engines. We always remembered them by their number. They were always numbered, and eventually went to the torch. By 1963, it was at the end of the steam.
While these changes were taking place, even while branch lines were being closed, the trains provided excursions and days out, holiday and seaside visits, football and hurling matches. Even in the fallow 50s, there was music and merriment on the trains. But for all that, the losses continued to mount.
But should they be regarded as losses or as necessary subsidies? On the one hand, why should a railway, which was performing a valuable public service, be expected to pay its own way? On the other, if the taxpayers no longer wish to subsidise it, should it be scrapped?
Todd Andrews was to prove the most controversial, and some would say formidable, head of the railways. For 30 years or more, this abandoned stretch of the line from Harcourt Street to Shanganagh and Dundrum has been the way Dubliners remember the man who, as the sentence has it, closed the Dundrum line, even as plans were made to house thousands of commuters along its route. But there was a lot more to it than just this, and of that we shall journey some more next week.
Train on a journey, train on a track, take me where I want to go. Take me back, building the line by the sweat of your brow and the strength of your own hand. With stone, steel and sand, ironing the land. Railway sleeper, get no rest. Ride the iron horse into the west. With a pick and a shovel to the mountain pass. The boys of the Barrow gang, with stone, steel and sand, ironing the land.
Well, if you'd like to learn more about the history and relevance of the train system in Ireland, or indeed recapture the magic of this series, the book Ironing the Land is available from bookshops nationwide.